Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. And thank you for being patient as we worked out some technical details today with some of our speakers. My name is Jeffrey Smith, and I'm your host for today's program, in which we will discuss and attempt to unpack the important topics of climate justice and environmental rights, arguably the most pressing issues of our time. Co-leading our discussion today is my colleague, Mentate Mloshwa. How are you doing today, Mentate?
I'm great, thank you.
Fantastic. I would also like to add, for those listening, today is actually our 20th episode of the Resistance Bureau, definitely a milestone to celebrate and an opportunity to thank our many loyal listeners across the globe who have helped us to learn, to grow, and to reach this point. So thank you from our entire team. As a way of perhaps refreshing your memory, the Resistance Bureau focuses on the major threats to democracy, human rights, and human dignity, while spotlighting the enduring struggles for freedom. This program features the leaders at the forefront of these critical fights, the activists, the journalists, and thought leaders, and we seek to build solidarity and networks among them. Indeed, what you see on the show today is only a portion of the overall work being done. It is in this spirit that we are joined today by a truly remarkable panel of experts. Ankalai, a Kenyan environmentalist and community organizer who received the prestigious Goldman Environmental Prize for her work on defending access to water for indigenous communities around Lake Turkana. Mizaiga, a climate justice campaigner from Denmark, who has worked tirelessly to preserve around the Congo Basin, home to one of the largest tropical rainforests in the world. Vijaya Ramachandran, a researcher on climate change and energy poverty who has held positions at some of the world's top think tanks. Currently, she is head of energy and development initiatives at the Breakthrough Institute, which identifies and promotes solutions to today's environmental challenges. NJ Ayuk, a lawyer, best-selling author, and chairman of the African Energy Chamber, based in South Africa, where he has long worked with indigenous companies and governments to grow the continent's energy sector in line with international best practices. And finally, we are joined by discussant Nazneen Moshiri, an award-winning journalist who is currently a senior analyst on climate and security with the International Crisis Group. Today, she will help lead our Q&A session at the end of today's show, along with our colleague Nick Cheeseman. Be sure to follow us on Twitter @ResistBureau and use the hashtag ResistBureauLive for today and for future shows. We are also streaming on Facebook Live and on YouTube right now and recording the show for later distribution. Mentate, before we turn to today's lineup of speakers, please set the scene for us, if you will.
Thank you so much, Jeff. We know that the vast majority of activists that are killed worldwide are actually those who die defending our land and our environment. Shockingly, 215 were killed last year alone. These activists are most likely to die precisely because the conservation of our common resources poses an ultimate challenge to the powers that be, especially in authoritarian context. It is by exploiting natural resources, diamond mines, sources of water, and arable land that allow corrupt leaders to get rich and dictators to get the money they need to pay for the security forces and stay in power. This is the reality that we need to confront today. Climate change, land rights, food shortages, extreme poverty, popular participation, conflict, and peace are not separate issues. They are all linked, and until we recognize this fact, we will not make any progress towards resolving them. But this is not straightforward because environmental protection may sit in the tension with generating income and development for impacted communities, while conservation can also bring in the baggage of colonialism. Given this, it is important that we have a stellar set of speakers to help us understand how we can fight for environmental justice in a truly progressive and inclusive way. As ever, we want you to be a part of this discussion by engaging us on our YouTube and Facebook comment section, and also by sending us a question via WhatsApp, and our number is +263 776 238 199. It is also available on screen right now in case you missed it. Jeff, I'll hand over to you to just draw in our panelists.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Mentate. Is our colleague from Kenya with us? Aiko, are you with us?
Yes, I am here.
Perfect. Thanks so much for joining us. Glad you could be with us and spend some time with us. I'd really love to start this conversation with you. We thought of you because you've really been on the front lines of these issues that we've been talking about, or that we will be talking about for many years. As many of our viewers might know, you were awarded the Goldman Prize for standing up for the environmental rights of indigenous communities around the Lake Turkana Basin. And we'd really like to ask you, how has that struggle to protect these human rights evolved over time? How has it evolved over the past decade? And really, what we'd really like to hone in on is how are these localized struggles that you've been dealing with part of the broader picture? In other words, why should someone listening today in Washington, D.C., for example, care about what's happening in your local community and the effects that it might have on them?
Thanks, Jeff. As you mentioned, some of the things, so when we started the fight in 2009, 2010, really just highlighting the impact of the Gibe 3 dam, but also follow up a few years later by the Gibe 4 and Gibe 5 on Lake Turkana. And it's very easy, to just say, oh, but it's a hydro dam, it's renewable energy, it's green energy. And I think that was the biggest struggle. The fact that while some solutions come that may be seen to be contributing to environmental justice, which may, something like hydro dams, but in actual sense, the impact on the livelihoods of the people, on their identity, their place they call home, that was something very personal to us. So the idea of the dam and how it impacted us was something that was very local to us. Yet at the same time, there was this push to say it's renewable energy, and so it's not coal. So it's something that you should all accept. And the biggest part was when energy is being generated in one area and it's similar, it's one area and it's being transported to a different area and no benefit to the community. So the aspect that development is destroying the lives and livelihoods of communities, it is disrupting their identities and sense of belonging. It leads to displacement and and all that. And then at that particular place, there is that energy is being generated to go elsewhere. You asked why it should matter. It is something that has been seen. We've seen this not only, when we were starting the fight against the Gibe Dam, we were learning from what had happened in many other places across the world, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, in India. And even after our struggle, you see the same struggle in the DRC with the Inga Dam. And yet, no lessons learned. Communities continue to be displaced. Women more so continue to suffer disproportionately. And some of this become the solutions to the climate crisis. So I think for me, that's what's very important, that because of a climate crisis, we see solutions being given, but the same solutions come from a very capitalistic, they come from an external person deciding for communities and not realizing that the local impact may not be what we are thinking about, but it really is, and it further exacerbates the climate crisis of communities, because this climate crisis is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening through land grabs. It's happening through privatization of water. It is happening through the dispossession of places that people can produce food and reproduce for themselves. And so it is happening in various spaces, and it is important for us to see this, to see how the local impacts contribute to the global and that. And so just to highlight, those are the reasons we get into this work, and we do this work every day, but just also to recognize that as the struggles have, years later, it's thinking around how do we take the local struggles and put them at the national and global level, but at the same time, how do we make sure that we really, not just the faces of myself and my colleagues, but also the real voices of communities, and capture those realities as they've changed over time.
Thank you so much. I think you raised quite a number of issues that I'm very excited, because they're actually part of the questions that we're going to be asking the rest of the speakers as well. But one question that I wanted to bring to your attention is based on an interview that you gave, where you spoke so much about how young people today, not just in Kenya, but elsewhere in the world, give you hope in the work that you're doing. So you look at the fact that Africa is looked at as the youngest continent in the world, which means that a majority of its populations are actually young people. What does that reference that you make to young people, being a hope for you, particularly men, looking at the work that you're doing and the role that they have in bridging some of the gaps that are there in the efforts to reverse some of the worst impacts of climate change?
I think, one, it's been interesting to see many of us in our time of going to school, spent our times as engineers or as environmentalists or as scientists. So it was very siloed. But then you're seeing a lot of young people not only looking at their work as engineers, but then what does that look like? What are the new forms of engineering that are recognizing of the climate crisis, but also just looking at local solutions? How do they come up with local solutions that really bring everybody on board, so that there's a sense of co-ownership, but also a sense of equity? It's not that all young people are it's not a homogeneous population, But the fact that if you see the people resisting development that is destructive, it is young people on the front lines. Whether in Uganda, whether in Kenya, you see all this Elizabeth. You see the young girls from the many young girls who are either highlighted by the media and those who are not, who spend time just highlighting their stories on social media. And you see them just collectively bringing their stories together on social media. So that's something that's really, and it's not only on the climate space. You see them on the streets of Nairobi asking around the price of food, because the price of food means that, the cost of living, the ability to pay for power, for electricity, the ability to buy a pint of milk and things like that. So really, you're seeing them questioning. I think, in Kenya we say uliza ujibiwe. Basically, you ask for you to be asked, to be answered, and it's seeing them really going out there using their different platforms to ask the big questions and be able to make sure that their voices are really on the front, are really at the top of the conversation.
Thank you so much. I would love to bring in Remy into the conversation. Remy, like many grassroots activists who work on sensitive issues, you have received death threats from suspected government agents in the past. You've even had to flee the country. How do you manage your work and the valid concerns of a safety, yours and your families, as well as your colleagues? What advice do you have for environmental rights defenders who might be listening to you today?
I think we just lost Remy from DR Congo. So Vijaya, I think we might bring her in. Mentati, do you have a question for
her? Before we jump to her, I wanted to just have like a follow-up for Aika, because I feel like she mentioned something that is very important for us. And even though we have like a question later that talks about that, she mentioned how a lot of the green energy that we speak about, that we hear about, comes in as a solution to the challenge of climate change. But you find that this solution not only, she talked about how this energy produced in local communities is actually moved to different parts or like totally different areas altogether, and communities don't benefit from that. So the biggest question I wanted to come in and ask, which maybe can open up to later the other guests, is around access to communities, because for people to come into communities and actually start producing that energy, it means that the responsible authorities locally are actually giving them that access or giving them that permission. So I just wanted you to speak into that, issues of access. How do they get into those communities, and what role do those people that give them the permission have in safeguarding the interests of the people?
Thank you. I think one of the key things is the laws in most of the African countries, but also the global south, of development being a public good. And because of that, then communities, if you look at most of the laws and legislations, it basically says you have a right to say, to consent, you can consent, but then they don't really give you a right to say no, and that becomes the challenge. So right now you're seeing a lot of governments coming in, and in fact, most of the corporations or development partners come into the region driven by government. So they come with government, guided by government to come to the area, meetings are called, and because resources tend to be found, or such developments tend to be done in most remote areas where government is either revered. There's a sense of there's no development, and most communities are asked, you're told, oh, we will bring you water or bring you education. So government pushes its obligations to a multinational company and uses that to allow for development to happen, or whatever sense of projects to be set up in this area. So the role of state, but also the dance, the political, that dance between state and corporation, state and capital, and how best we as citizens can be able to resist the capture, the state capture by capital, or by projects that really, in many ways, are detrimental to the region.
Thank you so much. I see that Remy has joined us. Remy, just to confirm that you can hear me. Remy, please confirm if you can hear me. Okay, so I think while we wait for Remy to join us, hopefully he will be able to join us. I'll just bring NJ into the conversation. NJ, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Perfect. So I want to bring you into this conversation. Obviously, your background is slightly different from most of the speakers that we have today. You're in the private sector and you've worked closely with African governments on a range of energy and development projects. How do you personally see the debate around economic development versus, protecting the environment? Often this argument is framed as a clash of ideals or a difficult trade-off. Is that really the case?
No, it's not a trade-off. And first of all, it's such an honor to be here. It's my first time to be invited to the Resistance Bureau. I think you guys doing an amazing job. You're really giving voices to those who really have not had their voices being put on the mainstream, and it's so important to be part of this. But I would take a different streak. I would say Dr. King Jr. teaches us that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. I think we all have a job to see that Africa which we have is developed and is grown forward. And I start with this. This night, we have 600 million Africans going to bed without any source of electricity. 900 million going to bed without any source of without clean cooking technologies. Most of them women. The other millions that have electricity, they are still not getting constant, abundant energy. The environment is so important, and it is not just we cannot just look at it from a trade-off perspective. This is a time when we need to start thinking about doing cleaner, better, and even get into decarbonization. Nobody loves the environment more than we do. But the real issue here, which I think we have to do, is that we cannot trade off Africa's development. Of course, I do agree that trade-offs with this notion of trade-offs have to be made. But I tell you this: Europe has to decarbonize. America and the OECD countries have to decarbonize, but Africa needs to industrialize. And I want you to pay attention to this for a minute. When you look at the global greenhouse gas emissions, Africa outside South Africa has emitted only 0.5. 0.5. If you add South Africa and North Africa, you're around 2.73. That is nothing compared to, but we are all in this together. It's called global warming, not Africa warming. So we have to drive up opportunities for Africa instead of young people crossing the Mediterranean to go find greener pastures in Europe and setting our own immigration issues. But then we have to get this commitment together, because, and I think this is one of the reasons why I'm so happy to be here, because African environmental groups need to be working with my side of the industry and say, how do we get this together? Could you believe after COP26, I was lucky to be in Glasgow, with all the commitments we had to face down coal and decarbonize. That was November 2021. In January, Norway, one of the countries that's made trillions of dollars in the sovereign wealth fund, gave out 52 oil licenses. The United Kingdom announced that they're going to open new coal mines. Germany is going back to building coal mines and building LNG terminals and drilling in the North Sea. In the North Sea, the United States has opened all federal lands for drilling, and now you look at Great Britain says they're going to do more licensing. When you have that, because you're looking at energy security and development, and you're looking at that in the big, rich, wealthy nations, how dare you tell somebody in Uganda, in Kenya, in Mozambique, in South Africa, that you cannot develop with these resources? And I end with this. It is very tough for me to tell everyday Africans, and even those in business, and even those whom you say you guys pollute, you guys try to develop, that we are going to rely on the promises that we have. Leave everything in the ground, don't touch it, let's all go green. Yes, let's do it. But here's the question I ask you. There's the climate funds that promise $100 billion to all developing countries every year in 2009. I was at COPE, we had those negotiations, $1.2 trillion has not been paid. Dr. King in the United States went to Washington and said he came to Washington to cash a check. A Negro came to Washington to cash a check marked with insufficient funds. Africa, this continent, is going to COP, it's looking at its future, it's looking at everything, because we've gotten that check that has been bounced. And if you don't do it for yourself, if you think you're going to get it by development aid, then you might not like what I say in this forum, but it's not going to happen. And making energy poverty history should be our rallying call, but we have to protect the environment, make it in cleaner, better ways. I'm all for it. But to shut down, no, we cannot. We got to find that balance.
Thank you so much, NJ. I'm really glad we have you on this program to bring in this perspective, because I think it's important that we touch upon these nuances, right? The space between the black and white and the cut and dry. And I'd like to stick with you for a moment, if we could, because you're one of the few prominent African entrepreneurs who actually talks openly, as you just did, about the intersection of business and good governance and democracy. Obviously, the climate crisis, which you just talked about, is regarded by many as an outcry over the impact of expanding business that is necessitated by government policies. And often, we have to talk about this, often illegal exchanges between custodians of natural resources with businesses. So how do you, in your position and through your work, see business and democratic governance interacting to do the reverse, preserving and protecting the land, the resources, and the environment? How have you seen this in your line of work, and what can you tell us about that?
Jeff, to my greatest disappointment, it's not been the best in our continent. I've written a book about it, Billions at Play, but I think it needs to get better. And that is exactly been the problem with natural resources and our communities. Communities have always felt they're not consulted, they're not impacted. My colleague just mentioned the last time that government even does that work for the big international companies. We need to find that healthy balance. I'll give you an example: local content. It should not just be a catchword. It should be where we look at really driving up, hiring local people, empowering local people, ensuring that they're part of that development. But also looking at the policies, how you embed environmental policies from the get-go in these projects, having that healthy conversation. That's why it's really important to have an active citizenry, active engagement that is really going to drive that. But also, as we also discuss this issue, we got to be bold to take on the big companies and really warn them. Yes, I come from a chamber that represents fossil fuel companies, and I get attacked by it all the time. But for me, I'm very vocal about it, because I'm African first before I'm a business person. I'm African first before I'm an energy person. But I'll be honest with you. If anybody in Africa today is not condemning these combat thugs from Glencore, that they were just fined $1.5 billion of bribing, corruption, and driving the most unethical practice in business in the continent, then we're not living up to our true obligation to really drive that conversation. That kind of stuff is what really drives people nuts. And the other part is that we got to hold governments accountable. It's really important. So if I'm part of this, I always say what we do, how we hold governments accountable, how we work with governments. It also improves a brilliant and a better environment, because you know what? Money goes where it is welcome. You're not going to create jobs without an enabling environment that way is free of corruption, mismanagement, more transparency, rules, that you're not going to start with business without an official saying, hey, I want a cut in it. But there are examples in our continent where you've had that policy and government and civil society working together with that intersection, combining itself. You've seen it in God's world. Look at the World Bank business rankings. Look at where you see Mauritius with the vast investments going in there. Look at countries like Namibia. Look at other countries like Seychelles. So you need to look at that, and democratic governance should be part of it. And I think that if we stop really advocating for issues like local content, community involvement, then we've lost it. We've lost it. We all have a role to play.
Thank you so much, NJ. I see that Remy is still not with us, so I will just jump in to bring Vijaya into this conversation. There's something that NJ mentioned, which I think centered a lot around the fact that Africa, for instance, doesn't have so much of a carbon footprint compared to the global north. as would want to refer to in this conversation. So there's actually been a standing argument online and offline about the global north being a leading contributor to the climate crisis, yet, you know, continents like Africa having to bear the largest consequences and having to play almost the bigger role in trying to reverse this. So what, in your view, is the role of the global north in ensuring that there is a just division, fair sharing, and equitable distribution of the benefits and burdens of climate change and responsibilities to deal with climate change?
Thank you, Matate. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. I think there's no question that the vast majority of the responsibility for decarbonization rests with the global north. There's no question that sub-Saharan Africa's footprint is tiny. You know, Africa together is 4% of global emissions. Cumulatively, it's half of 1% of global emissions. There is no question that the rich countries have created this problem, and the rich countries have to be the first ones to solve the problem, not the poorest countries. The burden of dealing with climate change and mitigating emissions should not fall on 600 million Africans who do not have access to electricity, or as our previous speaker mentioned, 1 billion people who do not have access to clean cooking. They should not be paying the price for mitigation. I think if there's any flexibility that is allowed in a global picture around carbon emissions, that flexibility should be given to the poorest countries. They should have access to any remaining carbon budget, not the richest countries. But what we are seeing today, particularly in the context of the war in Ukraine, is that rich countries are doing everything they can to secure more fossil fuels, to buy more natural gas on international markets, to open new coal plants, to extract also all kinds of fossil fuels to meet the demand that will arise from, or the excess demand that will arise because of the war and because they're not able to access supplies of natural gas in Russia. Given that that is the case, I don't think rich countries have any there's no way they should be able to tell poor countries that they cannot develop their own energy reserves. That seems to me to be hypocritical, immoral, and unjust, and it is exactly what's happening. So the same countries that are buying gas on international markets, buying gas from the US, buying gas from Qatar and so on, are telling African countries that they will not finance any type of fossil fuel development within Africa. I find that extremely hypocritical. It's sort of what I call a form of green colonialism, where you're doing whatever you like, and you're telling poor countries that they can't, that they cannot develop their reserves in the name of climate change. So I think that is a great injustice. I think it's going to be the center of conversation at COP27. I don't think this is going to go just by the wayside, as our previous speakers have mentioned. Number of European countries, for example, buying more coal, opening new coal plants, and so on. So I think that level of injustice has to be addressed. It has to be confronted and dealt with. I don't think we can put the burden of decarbonization on the poorest people or the poorest countries. And the other point I wanted to make is this notion that if we switch from fossils to renewables, all our problems are solved. And I think Ikal mentioned it at the beginning. Hydro has its own problems. We are trading off the problems for another, and we need to be honest about that. I don't think we should present renewables as sort of a be-all and end-all solution to the problem of emissions. And in that context, we talked about hydro and the kind of displacement problems with hydro. Also wanted to mention that solar panels, a very large share of solar panels are made using forced labor in Xinjiang province in China. Cobalt mining in the Congo, also very exploitative. These are not things that problems that are going to go away. These are problems that are going to require much of the same vigilance and much of the same types of demands for accountability as we have seen with the fossil industry. So I think a little bit more reality to this whole conversation, a little bit more recognition of the hypocrisy of the global north in this conversation. I think we need to confront them head on at COP27 and at other venues, and seek to have a system that's more just, that enables growth in Africa, that enables poverty reduction, that enables access to electricity. That should be a dominant concern. For me, it's my first concern. And then seek accountability in whatever source of energy you extract, whether it be fossil fuels or whether it be renewables. We need the kind of accountability that, we need governments to be transparent. Contracts need to be transparent. We need to worry about child labor. We need to worry about forced labor. These are kinds of concerns that won't go away. So I think a dose of realism and some, a movement towards a more just system, in my view, is very needed.
Thank you so much, Vijaya. You mentioned the war in Ukraine. Obviously, this is a show about climate change and the environment, but these issues are all interrelated, right? So I'd like to draw a bit more out on that and discuss these current realities and the realism that you were just speaking to. So obviously, we can't avoid the fact that the invasion has brought into stark relief how much Europe and really other parts of the world depend on natural gas as it transitions, albeit unevenly, to green energy, given some of the problems you were just expertly highlighting. So we're seeing now many countries are scrambling to cut new fossil fuel deals across Africa. Oftentimes, this is happening with highly kleptocratic, abusive, repressive leaders who've been in power for decades. The so-called resource curse. How do you see this playing out in the coming years, and how can actors on this stage resist making bad decisions in the context of a crisis?
Yeah, I think the crisis has sort of illustrated kind of the hypocrisy of this whole conversation, right? So on the one side, we have, organizations like the World Bank and others announcing fossil fuel financing bans and, statements being made at COP26 about how rich countries will fund wind and solar only. At the same time, we are seeing, because of the war in Ukraine and this unending demand for natural gas, that's not going to go away anytime soon. It's not going to go away for decades. So given that demand, we're seeing rich countries do the exact opposite: buy gas from every possible source, expand their own domestic fossil fuel extraction, and so on. It is a very strange situation. I think it's sort of these two stories playing out in parallel, with little connection, in fact, involving the same actors. So, Germany, for example, Chancellor Olaf Scholz was in Senegal about a week or so, 10 days ago, and said that he would be very interested to purchase natural gas from Senegal. And a German government official said that Germany might even be an investor in the GTA gas field off of the Senegalese coast. At the same time, Germany is pushing inside the World Bank for a ban on the financing of fossil fuels in African countries. This makes absolutely no sense. We need to get to a much better place, I think, in this conversation, much more realistic, less virtue signaling, less grandstanding. And just kind of a more realistic view of what everybody's energy needs are, whether it be in rich countries or poor countries or anybody in between. I take your point, Jeff, about kleptocracy and about lack of accountability and about corruption. This has plagued the fossil fuel industry for decades. And I think it will continue to be an issue as we transition to a wider range of energy sources. I don't think those problems are going to go away as we move away from, oil and coal to cobalt mining and other kinds of things. These are not sorts of problems that are easy to tackle. I mentioned the solar panel thing as well. So I think, increased accountability, we have to demand, civil society has to demand that, and has done so. I think has done a good job in many developing countries, demanding more accountability. I think contract transparency is critical. I think any kinds of new organizations that will govern the use of the extraction of precious metals, for example, for renewables, will have to really do its job in terms of addressing issues around human rights violations, around exploitation of indigenous communities, around the kinds of environmental destruction we see around extraction for renewables. Wind turbines are a set of issue around those as well. So, I think these problems don't go away. They're not easy problems, and we have to just keep pushing for increased accountability, increased openness. But I think banning certain types of energy in the poorest countries while doing whatever you like in rich countries is nowhere, it's not achieving anything. It's not the place to go. It's not the kind of place we should be in. And I'm really hopeful that we will get to a more just place as we have these conversations.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And you make a very good point about the need for accountability and the role of civil society and holding governments accountable. And that's a really great segue. If we're able to, Remy, our colleague from Eastern Congo, are you with us?
Yeah, I am with you. Thank you very much.
There he is. I know you're having some internet connectivity issues, but if you can hear us and answer quickly.
Thank you very much, Peter, to Jeffrey, to help me run this meeting. I am Mizaiga from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I am a climate activist and an indigenous leader who is fighting.
Are you still with us, Remy? I think we may have lost him. All right, with that, Nick, I think we're going to turn it over to you while we continue to work on Remy's connectivity issues. It'd be great to hear from him. As I mentioned, he's an activist in Eastern Congo working very closely on indigenous rights and climate justice issues. It'd be great to get his perspective. But thanks to our speakers who we've really learned a lot from today. And as mentioned, Nick, I'm going to turn it over to you. And we have a discussant today, Nazanin Mashiri from the International Crisis Group, who's an expert in this field as well, mainly the intersection between climate and security, to get their reactions and also to curate the questions that we received through our WhatsApp channel. So Nick, over to you.
Thanks, Jeff. And yeah, I'm sure all of our audience will understand the challenges we have connecting to people around the world, often on difficult places. So we'll do our best, and maybe we'll be able to come back to our speaker a little bit later if we clear that up. It's a real pleasure to be able to introduce Nazanin to you all. She is a renowned journalist with decades of expertise in the Eastern Horn of Africa. Today, she serves as a senior analyst on climate and security with the International Crisis Group, where she conducts field research and provides analysis on how to best respond to climate-related security risks in Africa and globally. And Nazanin, this is much more your area than mine, so I'm going to give you the floor. We'd love to hear your insights from your work with ICG, but we'd also love to hear your thoughts and insights on what you've heard from our speakers and any of the trends that you might bring out. Just for our speakers, please note that while Nazanin's giving her comments, I'm going to be putting into the chat some questions that have come in from our audience. I'll verbally give these to you in a minute, but if you want to get prepping, they'll be coming up in the private chat for the panelists in a minute. And Nazanin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you so much to the Resistance Bureau for inviting me on the show. Very interesting listening to your speakers there, especially Iqal. I met her on the shores of Lake Turkana in 2012 when I was doing a story about Ethiopia pursuing its controversial dam project. I mean, from Ethiopia's perspective at the time, if you remember, they wanted to generate an alternative energy source. But of course, as Iqal and many others pointed out, what they were doing was basically creating a potential environmental disaster. And I think that's the problem there when we're looking at these mega dam projects, for example, the GERD in Ethiopia at the moment, which is seen by some, say in Sudan or in Egypt, as an existential threat. For the Ethiopians, they see it as a climate adaptation tool, a way of dealing with these climate stresses that are coming with the erratic rainfall, with the issues, one of the worst prolonged droughts we're seeing in the region. And some would say maybe there is an opportunity there for these states to come together and to sort of find a way through these issues and come to the table and talk. Of course, there have been various attempts to try to bring those states to the table, and they haven't been fruitful as of yet. But I think it's an interesting issue there for maybe, a future discussion to look at these kinds of issues to do with climate and security from that kind of perspective. Is it an opportunity to bring people together to share these resources and to discuss that possibility and come to some sort of an agreement? But just in terms of my work that you were talking about, in terms of the way we see the climate and security debate, we see that climate change is already contributing to conflict risks in many parts of the world, and in many parts of the Horn and the Sahel region. And, we see that many people are dying needlessly because major powers are really failing to act accordingly on these major issues. And look, climate change is a story of extremes. Increasing temperatures, changing rainfalls. These things are no longer exceptional. You can talk to anyone here, from South Sudan to the Sahel regions, to northern Kenya. They will tell you they are no longer exceptional. And in recent years, we've seen, heat record after heat record being broken. We've seen weather patterns leading to fires, floods, cyclones, droughts. And all of this is having a major impact on natural resources, livelihoods, migration. And these risks are aggravating the risks of conflict and creating new ones too. And so we feel at Crisis Group, and I feel as a researcher on this topic, that this link between climate change and conflict is being overlooked. It should be looked at more closely. And it should be in the global discussions that we're having on mitigating and adapting to climate change.
Thank you so much. Great. Now I'm going to start with the questions I've got for the team. So Akal, I'm going to come to you first. And building on that comment there from Nazanin, I want to ask you, how can we make environmental politics mainstream politics? This is a comment that's come through from someone I know actually on our hotline from Kenya, who says, Kenya had the Greenbelt movement, but today we have a presidential election race in which climate change does not figure. How can we change that?
Are you asking that to me?
Yes.
Oh man. I've always put this way, it's all about movement, but we have to learn one thing. You've seen in Europe and the United States and most of the developed countries where you've had a lot of climate polarization, and sometimes the polarization doesn't necessarily help. But I think that for me, I would love that. I would love to see climate discussions in the African political scene. And here is why. We make leadership, we make politicians, we make lawmakers really stake out their clear position when it comes to climate issues, when it comes to corruption, when it comes to mismanagement, that because there needs to be a vigorous debate on this. And this is where young people come on board. Dr. King teaches us that the arc of a moral universe is long, but it's long, but it bends towards justice. We cannot get justice for climate and driving up development at the same time without putting up a movement to really do that. I do agree though, when we put that, most Africans would agree with me on saying we need to make energy poverty, because Nazanin was just talking about what Nazanin was just saying. Let me tell Nazanin this for a fact. If you, and I hope this doesn't happen, but if you shut down the African continent, you're still going to have a climate problem. And we cannot in Africa today we have been victims of colonization, victims of resources being taken out of these continents, victims of tax evasion, victims of bad practices. And then right now, we need to pay reparations to those that took our resources because they tell us so. I think there's something immoral with that they have to bring that. And unless you address that, unless you discuss climate justice, and not just energy transition, but a just energy transition, unless you have the guts to discuss that and put everyday people, their lives on the front line to defend this, then we're wasting our time. Because you might not like me, you might hate some of the things I say. The majority of Africans are with me. The majority of Africans are with me. They'll tell you to hell with the climate. If this looks like this is something that just comes from Europe telling us what to do, then you go ahead and you put that on the ballot. I'll beat you every day, anytime. Maybe I'll even run for office if climate gets on the ballot.
The second question for you here is, sorry, could you hear me during?
I can hear you
then? You can hear me, great. So I was just saying, Ikal, I think we lost you for a minute, but we're coming to you in a moment. Eji, I've got another question for you here, which is someone writes to us on our WhatsApp line. There are many accusations of private sector corruption and complicity in bad energy deals and processes that allow businesses to evade best practice. What do you say to these critiques? And what is the evidence that the private sector can be part of the solution rather than part of the problem?
Yes, what I say to these critics, you are right. But you got to get but the rule of law has to take place. That's why we at the African Energy Chamber, for example, will say you can't have free markets without the rule of law. The rule of law has to be strong. That's why we need to encourage more rule of law activities so that we can hold these perpetrators with justice. In a few words, when you have these bad deals and corruption, lock them up. Now, how do you trust the private sector to be part of this? I'll tell you how. You need to have a private sector that really reflects what you see with Africa. You need to have, and that's why sometimes we don't do well in Africa, because we don't have those good corporate governance standards. We have not really established that. We got to drive that. It's not some easy stuff. It is not our industry. The energy industry has not been the best industry of this. We got our bad apples, man. Last week I just told you about Glencoe. Those scumbags need to be in jail. I mean, let's be honest. If it was a bunch of Africans or a bunch of black guys that went around Africa bribing every street dog on the street and made $100 billion, they'll not only be banned, they'll be in jail, they'll be thrown, and they'll be castigated. Now you get Glencoe. They get a slap on the wrist. They get a fine, and they say you didn't have milk as a baby. That is wrong. That is what makes people skeptical about our industry. That is what makes people feel that our industry is not living up to its true meaning. And yes, Mr. Chaseman, that's what makes people get really skeptical to say, we don't think the energy industry can be part of that solution. I think civil society has to hold everybody accountable. And that's why I'm a big believer in what Barry Ralston says. We need to be a bunch of angelic troublemakers and really get this right.
Thank you so much. Okay, Kai, we're coming to you now. And the question for you, it was a question that takes us to Kenya. So I think you missed it before. I don't think you were on the line. But the question was, how can we make environmental politics mainstream politics? Kenya had the Greenbelt movement, but today we have a presidential election race in which climate change does not figure. How can we change that?
Thanks, Nick. I think one of the biggest challenges, and I think I built from what my colleagues just said before, but also the work that Wangari Maathai did. I think one of the main things is sometimes I feel that climate politics, environmental politics becomes very elitist. And until we can be able to break it down so that it is about water, it's about land, it's about production, it's about seed sovereignty, because then it stops being, you see, when we talk about climate justice, we've got to be able to say, what does really climate justice mean? Climate change, what does that mean to everyday citizens? So that it is farmers being able to say, farmers being able to ask about fertilizer. I remember, and if you look at it, it really is but it may not be front and center in the current election, but if you look at the time when, organic manure was trying to be made illegal, and farmers stood out and stepped up and said that is not right. When laws around milk production and seeds in Uganda, so you see that happening, but it is not captured. It is captured as farmers or peasant farmers standing up against this and that, but it is not linked to the climate conversation. And so it is part of the climate politics. It's part of environmental politics, but nobody is. I think the media. Challenge to Nazneen and her colleagues, the media doesn't capture it as a climate issue, but captures it as people just fighting for their survival, people fighting for their livelihood. But you see this across the country, across the continent, but it really is not the link, the intersectionality between livelihoods and climate is really not captured very well.
Thank you so much. Great answer. Really great answer. I think, unfortunately, we've lost Remy for the show. So I'm going to come to you, Vijay. Then maybe, Nazreen, I'll come to you for a final word before we go back to our host, if that's okay. Vijay, this is a question that comes from me, actually. I was just recently visiting Iraq, and one of the things that had just happened there was a series of sandstorms that have been very debilitating and coming partly as a result of climate-induced change, partly perhaps also as a result of the shutting off of water to Iraq from neighboring countries. But it really brought home, I think, to that country and to perhaps the government of that country, the impact of climate change and the fact that climate change is not, as we often imply in the West, something that will happen in the future if we don't get emissions under control. As we say in the blurb for this show, climate change is something that's happening today, displacing people, making people's lives harder, potentially generating conflict and so on. It seems to me that there's a sort of disconnect then in the way that the West talks about climate change and the way that climate change is actually felt in, what we might, for another want of a better word, called the global South. And I was interested in how you think we can change that. Is there a way we can connect to the reality of what's happening around the world? Often, as Ankalai said and others have said, to often quite vulnerable populations who have relatively little sort of political power. Can we connect what's happening there to the debate that we're having at COP in European capitals, in North American capitals, in order to get the urgency of the situation appreciated, in order to change the agenda, and in whose interest the conversation is being had?
Okay, thank you, Nick. So I think two things on that front. If we really want to confront the impacts on poor countries of climate change, there's two things. The rich countries have to decarbonize. They have to decarbonize and a lot faster. They are the vast majority of emissions. I think the US alone is 40% of emissions. So that's got to happen. It's happening quite slowly. And in the context of the current problems, energy security has trumped decarbonization, and we're seeing an increase in fossil fuel use rather than the opposite. So that's a tough problem. I think the decarbonization of rich countries where the carbon emissions are the greatest, that would impact poor countries. But we're seeing, I think, that progress has been slow, and it's been a very tough problem to solve. The other issue, I think, that would address the questions you're raising is much more money for adaptation. And there, the rich countries have really failed the poor countries. There was $100 billion commitment made, I don't know, in 2009 or something, that has still not been dispersed. Some money's been dispersed, and it's debatable how much, but that they have not come through. And if you look at I spend a lot of time looking at development committee statements and so on before World Bank annual meetings and all of this. And, what we'll find is countries will say that they need to provide poor countries with the means to adapt, whether it be, financing more power or providing, better resources to cope with climate change, more resilient buildings, early warning systems for major weather events, things like that. There will be talk about that. But when you look at what's actually happening, rich countries are far happier telling poor countries to mitigate emissions than they are to pay for adapting to climate change. I am hopeful that because COP27 is in Africa this year, that the conversation will switch to adaptation, to the kinds of money that's going to be needed for example, major coal producers like India and South Africa to exit coal. We're looking at billions, if not trillions of dollars for all of these industries to be shut down and things to be made cleaner. We're also looking at a lot of money for coping with climate change. Are poor countries going to be more resilient? If we want them to be more resilient, we're going to have to pay for it. And I think that rich countries should pay for it because this is a problem they have largely created. The adaptation conversation, I think, is at a very early stage. It's been something that rich countries have avoided in favor of climate targets, but I think it's something they're going to have to cope with. There's also this parallel conversation going on loss and damage, which many African countries have been pushing at COP and which rich countries refuse to discuss in Paris. And then the last COP in Glasgow, they decided they would hold one workshop. So there's been incremental progress there, but maybe at COP27, it'll be front and center again. And there will actually be some type of compensation for the impacts of climate change. But these are, I think, really tough conversations requiring lots of resources that I don't think the global North can avoid any longer.
Thanks so much. I don't want to be a pessimist at the end of our talk, but I do worry about the impact of events in Ukraine on that process that you described, both in terms of the appetite to force moves away from other kinds of energy, and also, of course, because of the resource diversion that we've already started to see from parts of Africa and elsewhere into the Ukraine situation, which, of course, we fully understand given the emergency there. But it does mean that there's a risk that attention shifts from the kind of areas that we're talking about to a very different theatre. Nazanin, over to you for the final word, and then I'll take us back to our host to wrap up.
Thank you so much. Very interesting there, talking about COP27, many viewing it as African COP. But again, I just want to reiterate that looking at the area that I cover here in Sub-Saharan Africa, half of the world's most climate fragile countries are also facing conflict or crises. So any adaptation efforts that we're talking about can be severely impaired if conflict isn't considered in there. And any kind of well-intentioned climate adaptation could potentially do more harm, again, if those local security ramifications
Yes, absolutely. I agree. And I think one of the things that worries me the most is that exactly as you say, I mean, I've been involved in doing some conflict analysis and assessment work in a number of different countries. And one of the lines in every single one of those reports is that conflict and tension between communities in difficult areas is exacerbated by drought because it increases tension over water. And that, of course, is something that's going to get worse before it gets better. So this connection between conflicts, between the environment, and of course what we highlighted in the description of the show, which is the attacks on environmental activists by governments and by often people who are unidentified but perhaps are connected to governments or to energy organizations because they are involved in because they're involved in things that directly challenge control over valuable resources. That is something that's particularly concerning, and I think something that we really need to be putting front and center in the future. So thanks so much. We've had a wonderful discussion. Unfortunately, we had some technical challenges, as we sometimes do on the Resistance Bureau. That's because of our commitment to bring people from across the world together to have these conversations. But we still heard some brilliant comments from really great people working at the coalface, and I'm sending it back to Jeff and Mantade to take us home. Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Nick. It's unfortunate that we couldn't have Remy on the show today, but we'll make an effort to either have him do a separate interview that will spread across our social media platforms or have him on a Twitter space. And I would have loved to go on with this conversation because I think there's so many issues that are coming up which need further discussion, but there's only limited time for the show. So I just want to say thank you to our audience for engaging with us today. We saw a couple of comments coming up online. We'll definitely engage with some of you after the show as well. But thank you so much to everyone that continues to come back to the show, that has been supporting us for the past 2 years, and also just for tuning in today. We hope to keep seeing you in the future programs. A special thank you to our panel of experts for a job well done. I think you raised a very diverse range, you raised very different issues that I think are critical and in some ways very connected. The Resistance Bureau team looks forward to keeping in touch with all of you and to highlight the great work that you're doing in your different spaces. And for all our viewers, please stay in touch with us by visiting our new and improved website, theresistancebureau.com, as well as subscribing on our homepage. Please follow our social media platforms on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, as well as subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also revisit some of our past shows, all of which are on our YouTube channel and available on our website in the episode section. As a final note, thank you so much to the team that works with us behind the scenes to make this program a success. Thank you to our tech manager, Peter Dory, as well as our creative director, Ndona Msaga, who work behind the scenes to make the Resistance Bureau a continued success. Thank you everyone for joining us. Please continue to engage on Twitter. I've seen a lot of discussion around the topic that we're raising today, as well as on Facebook. Please continue to engage with the speakers, as well as with the team from the Resistance Bureau. Thank you and goodbye.